After the assassination of President McKinley in 1901, the United States elected a chain of 3 progressive presidents. They are interested in reforming and reshaping the infrastructure of the country, its businesses, and the way that it dealt with other nations. Under their leadership, the United States became a world power.
However, this era of change could not last indefinitely. The people of the United States blamed the progressives for the country's involvement in the First World War, and as a result they elected a string of 3 conservative, do-nothing presidents who promised to bring about a return to normalcy. During the terms of Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover from 1920 to 1932, the government focused its efforts inward. It loosened its hold on businesses and tried to keep itself out of foreign affairs.
Strangely enough, this style of government seemed to work brilliantly. The 1920s were a time of prosperity, glamour, and excitement. Thanks to new easy loans and payment plans, even lower-income Americans could buy more expensive goods, and as a result, the stock market grew to an all-time high. In general, the quality of life was perceived as excellent, and Americans were, for the most part, living a carefree, exciting life.
However, beneath the surface there were growing problems. The rich continued to gain wealth while the poor struggled to make ends meet. The abuse of credit led to a false sense of growth and in turn to rampant overproduction. New technology diminished the need for workers and many people began to lose jobs. Then, on Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the economy could handle no more and all the mounting problems in the system culminated in a massive stock market crash.
The United States had now officially entered the Great Depression, and the carefree times of the last decade were all but forgotten. The entire country was now thrown into turmoil. Businessmen and farmers, ruralites and city folk alike felt the sting of unemployment, poverty, and hunger, as 25% of the workforce lost their jobs. In the coming years, 5,000 banks would close, wiping out 9 million savings accounts totaling over $2.5 billion. 54,000 businesses collapsed, and farm incomes dropped 60%. With the millions of Americans struggling to survive, new things popped up on the national landscape. Soup lines as far as the eye could see, ramshackle towns made up of migrant workers, referred to as Hoovervilles, men begging to do humiliating jobs for a piece of bread to feed themselves and their families. These extreme circumstances took their toll on people. Family members starved and died, homes were lost, desperate fathers deserted. People were frustrated, confused, and angry, and they really had no recourse. Or did they?
One of the first things that happens in times of trouble is that people cling to things that they know, things that they trust, and things that they can depend on. For many common Americans that had lost everything, there was very little that they could cling to but themselves and each other. They had to support their neighbors. Between 1930 and 1935, as many as 750,000 farms were lost. But in many cases, farmers put up quite a fight for their neighbors. Whenever farms were lost through bankruptcy, fellow farmers from around a county would gather to assure that a neighbor would be able to buy back his own place and goods by keeping bids down to pennies, nickels, dimes, or quarters. Outside bids were kept in check by symbolic nooses that were hung nearby. One farmer was quoted as saying, "In our part of the country, when a sales comes on, we warn outsiders that anyone buying a place won't find life worth living there."
This attitude also led to a heightened sense of racial tension. Everyone suspected that other people of other races were trying to take their jobs. In the 1930s, many African Americans made their living by farming somebody else's land. When the Depression hit, whites suddenly became desperate and wanted the jobs, pushing thousands of black men out and leaving them without an income. Other minorities in the U.S. were faced with similar situations. Thousands of Mexicans and Asians were pushed out of their jobs and deported. Meanwhile, racism was running rampant. Lynchings were increasing steadily and things were getting out of hand. On March 25, 1931, a fight broke out between a group of black men and a group of white men on a freight train traveling through Alabama. The white men were beaten and thrown off the train, and they immediately reported the incident to the police. The train was ordered to stop in Scottsboro for an investigation to take place, and 9 black men were immediately arrested for assault and battery. The police then searched the train and found 2 young white women who informed them that the black men had gang raped and assaulted them. An all-white jury completely ignored overwhelming amounts of evidence in favor of the Scottsboro boys and sentenced all but one to death. The Supreme Court eventually threw out the verdict and declared it unconstitutional. All the boys were either paroled or escaped, and none was ever executed.
With millions of Americans struggling to get by, they turned to their employers for more money. Companies, however, were not bringing in the profit to fulfill the workers' demands for higher wages. With no other choice, the desperate workers went on strike, leading to some of the most violent labor confrontations in the history of the United States. Republic Steel employees were outraged at the fact that U.S. Steel had signed a contract with the Congress of Industrial Organization, and they had not. Only 2 months after U.S. Steel had signed their contract, Republic Steel workers decided that something had to be done. On May 26, 1937, 70,000 workers in 27 plants in 7 different states walked out on their companies. The companies countered with the bloodiest anti-union battle of the decade. 1,500 workers, along with their wives and children, gathered outside the Republic plant in South Chicago, chanting, "CIO, let's go!" The Chicago police broke up the demonstrators using tear gas, nightsticks, and gunfire. The result was a bloodbath that left 10 people dead and injured more than 100 others. This terrible day in United States history came to be known as the Memorial Day Massacre. Republic Steel continued to strike for the following 2 months, but exhaustion and hunger got the best of the strikers and sent them back to work in July of that same year. Although Republic Steel did not win, it wasn't a lost cause. In 1937, there were more than 4,500 strikes, and labor won more than 3/4 of them.
One of the saddest events in the history of the country was actually a labor dispute between the government and its veterans. In the summer of 1932, thousands of World War I veterans hijacked a train and traveled from Portland to Washington to petition President Hoover for an advance on a bonus they were set to be paid in 1945.
Know when I get this money, I'm going to have my teeth fixed and my wife's teeth because they're just as bad as mine, and I'm going to buy some clothes for my kid.
The marchers made it to Anacostia Flats in Washington, D.C. in mid-June and set up camp, planning to stay a while. A bill was introduced that would grant the veterans the bonus immediately. It passed through the Senate but was defeated by Congress. The veterans remained in their camps and Hoover sent them an eviction notice. On the morning of July 28th, Hoover decided to oversee the evacuation, but specifically asked that no force be used. General MacArthur took a small force to evict the squatters, and on arrival they were pelted with bricks and glass. Ignoring Hoover's instructions, he called in the army. The campers were attacked with bayonets and tear gas, and then the camps were burned to the ground. The incident left 1 infant dead and another partially blinded. The outrageous violence angered many people, and Hoover was widely blamed, despite MacArthur's insubordination. It worsened Hoover's already negative reputation and practically ensured FDR's victory in the coming election. By 1940, more than 8 million Americans were members of organized labor. After the loss of many lives and uncountable injuries, organized labor was moving in the right direction.
When the Depression first hit, the government initially did very little. Hoover had been elected as a hands-off president, and he made only very poor attempts at economic and social recovery. In 1932, the people elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he took an active role towards fixing the problems of the Depression with his New Deal. But to some Americans, even this was not enough, and they began to look for more radical ideas for reform. Senator Huey P. Long of Louisiana was a man who many people supported. His motto was, "Every man a king," and he promised to put it into action by breaking up large accumulations of wealth and redistributing it equally among all Americans. As governor of Louisiana, he had already given the state badly needed schools, roads, bridges, and hospitals before he was elected to the United States Senate. People had seen him put his ideas to work before, and they thought he could do it again. With the idea that every American family was entitled to own a house, automobile, and a radio, he was reaching the height of his popularity with poor Americans. However, his extremely radical ideas angered many Americans, and he was violently hated by a separate portion of the population. Though he promised to take from the rich and give to the poor, in actuality, Long put into action a number of taxes which hit the poor much harder than the rich. And this hypocrisy angered more people still. Despite his opposition, Long was still widely popular and gaining confidence in the dream of the White House when he was shot and killed in the State House in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
The Great Depression took a painful toll on nearly every American. Millions of people suffered from hunger, property loss, and humiliation. After all the government spending and jobs created by the New Deal, the Depression ended with World War II. Americans were back at work due to high demand for military supplies. America was out of the Depression and on its way to recovery. Many countries after a Depression turned to fascism or make major political changes. However, the United States remained virtually unchanged. left only with the painful memories of the past decade.